David Menzies of Rebel News was arrested yesterday after an altercation with the RCMP while trying to ask Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland questions about Iran. Here's what happened.
Ms. Freeland, how come the IRGC is not a terrorist group? Why is your government supporting Islamo-nationalism? What? Excuse me. What are you doing?
You're under arrest for assault.
What, sir?
Why are you pushing me? You're under arrest for assault.
Who are you?
You're under arrest for assault. Police, you're under arrest for assault.
How am I under arrest? You bumped into me.
You pushed into me.
You bumped. I was just scrubbing. I got my credentials here, and you just bumped into me. So excuse
Police, you're under arrest.
What is your name and your badge? What is your name and your badge?
You've been told you're under arrest.
Why am I under arrest? He blocked my way.
In a statement to CBC News, York Regional Police, who were assisting the RCMP security detail, wrote, "It was determined that no credible security threat existed and the subject was released unconditionally shortly thereafter." Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has commented on the video on social media, writing, "This is the state of freedom of the press in Canada in 2024 after 8 years of Justin Trudeau." And the CBC has just received this statement from the RCMP. As publicly reported, RCMP protective policing resources were involved in an incident while deployed on a protective operation. The RCMP is looking into the incident and the actions of all parties involved. No further comment is available at this time. Now, Rebel News says it may sue both police forces and Minister Freeland. Did the police overstep here? Time to bring in the power panel. Emily Nicolas is a columnist with Le Devoir. Vanguard Strategy CEO Michel Cadario is here, as is Matthew Dubé, Vice President of Proof Strategies and a former NDP MP. And here with me in the studio is Kate Harrison, the Vice Chair at Summa Strategies. Okay, gang, look, there's a lot going on here. This is not the first time David Menzies has been arrested. He was arrested for harassing, allegedly, Melissa Lantsman, a Conservative MP, a candidate at the time, and there's a whole bunch of things about Rebel News that we can get into in this conversation. But Michelle, I just want to start with you. You worked with Paul Martin. The RCMP security detail was around him when he was Prime Minister. Very different media environment than the one we're dealing with now. What did you make of what we saw in that video?
Well, I think we have to remember there's got to be room for everybody to be able to do their job. Certainly, journalists need to be able to do their job. The protective detail have a job to do as well, as do the politicians. My experience with the Prime Minister's detail was that they were the absolute epitome of responsibility. They took their job very seriously, and they also appreciated that that there had to be interaction with the candidate and the Prime Minister and people, the regular public, as well as journalists in that. And they always made room for that. So there was also certainly times when there was higher threat levels, and those aren't things that are made public. But at those times, it was a bit of a closer box around the Prime Minister, or around whoever they're going to do. So we don't know what was there. It is interesting to note that the only journalist who's ever been arrested is this one from the Rebel, who has and the last time they did it was to Melissa Lantsman, a Conservative MP, and so that's interesting detail as well about perhaps how he's conducting his business. From what we saw of the video, it was, as a layperson, it seems not something that one would think someone would get arrested for. I'll say. But we also don't have the full context, and I guess that will come out as the RCMP review it. Right.
So Emily, look, Menzies, the Rebel, they are not part of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, though the Conservatives have been demanding that the Parliamentary Press Gallery take a position on this today. They would not be defined as a mainstream journalistic organization. They sometimes they push to create controversy, and then they fundraise on this. But Emily, what he did there in the video that we see, he's just walking along asking a question. I've done this many times in my career. I assume you've done this many times in your career. And he bumps into a police officer and then is arrested for assault. So all the issues with Rebel Media aside, what the police did there, what's your sense of that? He's just asking a question. He bumps into somebody and then he gets handcuffed and taken away.
I think there's so many different things that need to be taken into consideration. it's true that what we see in the video, he's walking toward her. He did arrive very fast in a way that can make a person feel, jumpy. And that's probably part of what happened. And if you make a person feel jumpy and they see you there with Rebel News and they don't, consider you a real journalist, they might escalate more than if they saw a CBC mic. That might have been part of the very instant, because it happens in a snap, a couple of seconds of what happened. There is a way for security to make sure that a person leaves an elected official personal space while they're asking questions without arresting them. And that's not what ensued. And so that's also an issue. There's a third issue that is not necessarily directly related to the video that I just want to put out there, is that there are a lot of women in politics who are being harassed physically by citizens who follow them everywhere. And there is a question that needs to be asked in terms of, if that citizen decides to become a journalist, then is the harassment something that becomes, a professional thing that we cannot say anything about? And so there are gender dynamics here. There's police overstepping. There's the issue of the reputation of Rebel News and that specific person's reputation. And then there's the issue of, is there a way to make sure that, when journalists ask questions to a politician, they leave them personal space without arresting the journalist who's being maybe a little bit too coming too close too fast. And so there's all of those things that could have been unfolded, differently for sure. No,
those are all very good points. So but Matthew, you were an MP, you've been in scrums, right? I'm sure you've walked along with reporters asking you questions. So I just want to play this moment again, if we can just cue up the tape, where you see that the Mountie steps in a little bit towards Menzies, and he bumps into him before Minister Freeland, moves to the other side of the pillar. And then Menzies said, "Excuse me." Then he's told he's being arrested for assault. Now, I've banged in to the Prime Minister's security detail, Matthew, a few times in tight things. I've never been arrested for this. Is this a case of the police overstepping? Because while Emily makes very good points about the harassment of women in politics, Menzies was detained for assaulting a police officer and then later released. Is this overstepping?
It's a good question, but I think there's a few things that are important context. I think the first is a point that Michelle raised earlier about not knowing the full threat context around, Minister Freeland in this case, and obviously politicians more generally. There's definitely a jumpiness that Emilie alluded to as well that I think comes into play when there's certain factors to consider. And listen, I mean, I don't want to do a sports instant replay thing here on the video, but you wonder sometimes if the individual in question is deliberately being confrontational with security detail in a way, to your point, even alluding to yourself, David, would not be. It's clear when it's an accident versus someone who's trying to be confrontational for the purpose of the format that these individuals are engaged in and the subsequent fundraising campaigns and social media attention that it garners among a particular audience. And it's perhaps not to be ignored, we've mentioned it a few times, that the Conservative deputy leader now, of all people, then candidate Melissa Lantsman, was also involved in a similar incident. So when you see a pattern begin to emerge, you do start to question the way that the individual behaves. You start to wonder how the individual is being perceived. I suspect that there's a conversation to be had about whether, the security detail needs to be better briefed about individuals like this if they are going to be getting into these types of sort of clickbaity, if you'll forgive the expression, confrontations with politicians. But it's a very fine line, but this is an unfortunate result, I think, of the climate that we're in. That's very different than being in the House of Commons with accredited journalists scrumming a former MP, to stick with the example that you drew out just a moment ago.
Okay, what's your read on all of this one?
Yeah, I mean, what I observe is an obvious overstepping by law enforcement. I do think if we were talking about this instance with another journalistic entity, frankly, I think if we were even talking about it as a member of the public, and I think back to that incident in 2022 with Minister Freeland being obviously harassed verbally
in Alberta, in a hotel check-in.
Exactly right, and no consequence for that when I think it actually would have very much been warranted. And then the treatment of this, I think it's right for people to look at these two instances and say, okay, there seems to be a misapplication here of the law or how it is being enforced. So I think it is an obvious overstep, and had you taken a beat to answer the question, or had law enforcement not intervened in that way, that clip, that kind of fundraising moment that Matthew is talking about, wouldn't have been provided. And in fact, those kind of interactions happen on an almost daily basis with Rebel News and with other, I'll say, non-traditional media outlets, where the questions are asked and ignored and those clips aren't provided. Because of the way law enforcement handled this situation, they've been able to kind of make a moment out of this. And the longer they go without providing detail, like the statement that you referenced, the longer without clarifying this, the bigger window that becomes.
So, Kate, just to stick with you, the Conservatives have jumped on this, right? Because everything is an opportunity to play wedge politics now. They say this is after 8 years of Justin Trudeau, press freedom is under assault because journalists are being arrested for asking questions. Now, they don't mention that Melissa Lansman, this incident a couple of years ago, where the same guy was arrested for whatever his interactions were with her. What do you make of that? I mean, we have seen Pierre Poilievre abuse journalists who work for Canadian Press and CBC for asking questions, belittling them, in scrums on live TV.
There's a confrontational tension there.
So, I mean, what do you make of this tactic that they're employing here today on this one?
Yeah, I think what we see them acting on now stems from the legacy beef that they have with mainstream media and kind of the relationship with government, right? So this adds another layer of complexity to what the Conservatives feel is a very favorable treatment by this government towards mainstream media organizations. They would probably point to, C-18 and other legislation that has largely benefited mainstream organizations as being demonstrative of the closeness of that relationship. I like to think that if this were, again, another entity, the Conservatives would also have something to say about the treatment of the press. We don't yet know, because to a point made by a fellow panelist, this is the only instance where this has been applied in such this way.
But Michelle, do you think this is a defense of press freedom, or is this they've been calling out the press gallery for not taking a position on this, or do you think it's an attempt to try to discredit, the mainstream media, the Ottawa media in particular? What do you think the end game is here for the Conservatives?
It's complete and utter hypocrisy is what it is. And they're just taking, a certain situation and trying to make fuel out of it. He was absolutely silent on press freedom and arresting journalists when this happened to Melissa Lansman. It's incredulous to me that he's actually being taken seriously in terms of this statement that he's saying. Tone it down and come back to reality. If there may be a operational issue that happened there, but I hardly think that Pierre Poilievre has all of a sudden become the grand master of standing up for journalistic integrity and press freedoms in society.
Emily, what's your take on that?
I do think that there is obviously partisan politics at play. At the same time, regardless of the messenger, I think there is a message that is worth, or a conversation that is worth to be had, more generally speaking, in terms of what are the limits. There's something to be balanced, I think, in a climate where there's more and more people who are being just very angry with politicians with reasons we might very much agree with or not agree with, and how to deal with that, how to let that anger express itself. We've seen several incidents, for example, in the last months, of people calling on elected officials to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and talking, for example, coming up to Mélanie Joly in a way that's very close. Nobody was arrested, and I think it's important that people continue to be able to do that. And at the same time, we need to realize that if both journalists and citizens are being more and more physically confrontational with elected officials, it will eventually have an impact on who wants to have that job. And the people who will be, I don't want to be accosted on the street and have people in my face from, coming from behind at any time of day. Most of them will be women. Yeah. And those are the people who are most likely to not stop being interested in the job of being an MP if we normalize also this tactic of either protest and or asking questions.
Matthew, I'm going to give you the last word on this, then we're going to pivot to our second topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that there's a message being directed to a specific audience. I think that's what's happening with Pierre Poilievre's tweet, the post today that he made. It's, red meat, dog whistle, call it whatever political communications metaphor you want. This isn't an issue, I think, ultimately that's important for people who are dealing with the issues that he likes to talk about, like affordability and housing and things like that. This is directed, I think, to a very specific group of people, the people who like to say that Canada has become a dictatorship in the last 8 years under Prime Minister Trudeau. Hence, him using essentially that language, saying, this is Canada after 8 years under Prime Minister Trudeau. At the same time, it's also a very old hat because we heard the same thing at the end of, in the last dying days of Prime Minister Harper's government, and arguably before that even. Right. So it's a recurring theme, but I think in this particular instance, he's very much speaking to the same audience that the fundraising email is. And I think that's the most concerning thing here, because it riles up a segment of people who think that there's some kind of, power play going on here from the political class. And it emboldens a certain type of individual that I think just is going to exacerbate exactly this kind of situation today, the security implications around it. And let's not forget some of the things that we saw in the last election, stones being thrown at the Prime Minister. And the Melissa Lantsman situation is particularly important because I think it's a reminder that no party is immune to this, even if one party or another may be more culpable of emboldening it. It's a stone in a glass house, I think, for everyone in this instance.